Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on StreamYard today, Facebook Live, and on YouTube for our special presentation, Food for Thought in August. I want to start with a couple of announcements, a program announcement as well. We will have Paul Pruitt back at a later date to do his presentation on Julia Tutwiler. We're very excited today to share with you a substitute program that ties in just as well to an upcoming event we have here at the Archives, but we will have Dr. Pruitt back at a later date, so look for more information on that soon. We have been, for the last several weeks, and every hour today for except this hour, working on the opening of our new exhibit on women's suffrage called Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote. This exhibit will open on August the 26th and will be on view through the end of May 2022. So we want you to see our exhibit. We want you to do so safely. The doors to our exhibit will be open on Thursday the 26th, and the exhibit will be open when the Archives building is open from now until May. So we encourage you to come see it. When it's a little later in the year, when it's a little safer to do so, we will also announce a full slate of exhibit-related programming and gallery talks as well. So Justice Not Favor opens on the 26th, and you can find more information about that on the Archives website and on our social media pages. Our September Food for Thought will be on September 16th, Thursday at noon, hopefully in person, but it will also be right here, streaming live, whether it's in person or not. The speaker is Andrew Frank, who's a historian at Florida State University. Dr. Frank will be talking about an interesting subject called Food in the Native South, the Curious Case of Coon Tea. And if you don't know what coon tea is, then you can listen to the presentation and find out on September 16th at noon. Introduce you to our special substitute speaker today. Is one of our own. We're very pleased to have Dr. Alex Colvin, our programs curator here at the Department of Archives and History, talk to you about some of the work that she did during the research for Justice Not Favor. Dr. Colvin holds degrees in history from Samford and Auburn universities. Her dissertation, The Sehoy Legacy, Kinship, Gender, and Gender in the Creek Tensaw Community, won the Distinguished Dissertation Award at Auburn University. She is also the 2021 recipient of the Distinguished Alumna Award for Samford, and she has won the Jacqulyn Dowd Hall Award from the Southern Association of Women Historians. All very distinguished, very important awards, and we are so pleased to have her as our programs curator. She worked very much so on the 2019 on the bicentennial celebration, especially the final event that we had here at the Archives. She also has been a critical player on the team that will be bringing you Justice Not Favor, our suffrage exhibit. She serves as the association's representative on the Alabama Women's Centennial Committee, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that soon. We are so pleased to have her and talk to you today about the 11th hour, Nina Pinckard, and the fate of the vote in Tennessee. It's very timely as we have just crossed the 101st anniversary of the vote in Tennessee for the 19th Amendment, and we are coming up on the anniversary of its ratification and addition to the U.S. Constitution, which will be August 26th, the day our exhibit opens. So, Dr. Colvin, welcome.
Thank you, Scotty. All right, so let me set the scene. It's August 18th, 1920. Nashville, Tennessee. 97 exhausted but determined state legislators enter the Tennessee state capitol to decide the fate of the 19th Amendment, which, if passed, would give women the right to vote in the United States. Now, it had taken nearly 100 years for suffragists to convince Congress to pass. Now they only needed one more state to make it an amendment to the Constitution. So you have suffragists entering the crowded gallery to hear firsthand what these Tennessee politicians would decide. Among the crowd sat Montgomery's own Nina Pinckard. But she did not sit with the suffragists. You see, she was one of the South's leading anti-suffragists, working to block the amendment. Now today I'd like to introduce you to Nina Pinckard, as well as discuss what some of her arguments were against the amendment and how she played a role in that final battle for women's suffrage. So who is Nina Winter Pinckard? Well, she was born in March of 1874 to Judge John Winter and Sarah Calhoun Winter of Montgomery. Now, she had a very illustrious ancestry, if you will, many notable people in her family history, including one person who was an aide-de-camp to General George Washington in the American Revolution. Now, in more recent family history, her great-grandfather, John Winter, was one of Montgomery's first industrialists. And then you have also her other great-grandfather, John Gindrat, who was a very important man who had the Marquis de Lafayette stay at his home in Montgomery in 1825. On her mother's side, she is the great-grandniece of John C. Calhoun, the famous antebellum politician from South Carolina. So with this ancestry, she was a jewel in Montgomery society. And soon after her debut, she married John Steptoe Pinckard, a lawyer and developer in Montgomery. And they held many elaborate parties at their home in Capitol Heights. And one magazine discussed Nina Pinckard's abilities as a hostess, calling her an artiste. Always, tactful and unselfish at all times. Now, Pinckard joined several women's societies, including the Colonial Dames, Daughters of the American Revolution, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She was involved with Montgomery charities and in social circles, but we don't know what her stance on women's suffrage was in her earlier years. You see, the first organized women's anti-suffrage group didn't form in Alabama until 1916, and it was in Selma. There's about 500 women who joined, but really the membership was concentrated in Selma and Gadsden, so we don't know about Montgomery members. Maybe she could have been, but likely not, because she later said that before 1919, she really didn't give women's suffrage much thought. So what changed? What got her attention? Well, on June 4th, 1919, Congress passes the 19th Amendment. And here's what it says. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what that's saying is, well, you cannot make a law that says that women cannot vote. There may be other requirements, but one disqualification cannot be because of their sex. And that's where most people end. That's where all the more interesting bits are. But there's actually a second section to the 19th Amendment. And it says, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And again, it usually doesn't get added because it's not that interesting, right? But it's important for understanding the anti-suffrage argument. So you have this passed, and now what does it have to do? It goes to the states for ratification. To be ratified, an amendment has to have 3/4 of the states to ratify it, and then it becomes a part of the Constitution. In 1919, that meant 36 states needed to ratify it before it would become law. Or, if you're an anti-suffragist, 13 states needed to reject it, so it would not become a law. So you have these two groups forming, the suffragists who have already been formed for a very long time on the national and local level, working to get it passed state by state, and the anti-suffragists who had a national organization and a few local organizations, but that really took the cause of preventing ratification seriously now, because the threat was real. And that's what happens in Alabama. On June 17th, so within 2 weeks of it being passed, you have Nina Pinckard inviting a lot of influential women in Montgomery to her home, and a constitutional lawyer to form the Women's Anti-Ratification League of Alabama. Their objective: prevent Alabama's legislature from passing or ratifying this amendment. So you have Nina Pinckard as president of this new organization, but the executive committee boasted of many notable women, including Marie Bankhead Owen, who served as legislative chair. Now, Owen was a part of a very politically influential family. Her father was a U.S. senator until 1920, and after that, her brother took up that same position, while her other brother served in the U.S. House of Representatives and was Speaker of the House. Her husband, Thomas M. Owen, was the founder and first director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And when he passed away in 1920, she would take up that position, making her the second director of the archives and the second woman in Alabama to head a state agency. So you have these two women, Nina Pinckard, who before, we have already heard, before 1919 really didn't give much of women's suffrage a thought, and Marie Bankhead Owen, who reported that she actually was okay with the notion of women's suffrage. But now they are united together in blocking this amendment. Why is that? What threat did the 19th Amendment give to their position in society? Well, to understand that, we have to understand their arguments. The first one is gender. Now, this might be one that you immediately think of when you think of the anti-suffrage movement. The gendered argument really focuses on the idea that there are two spheres. There's the sphere in the home, and there's this political sphere. And women's sphere is remaining in the home. They are mothers, caretakers. They're there to take care of the home, to raise the next generation, to provide a haven for men who have to leave and go into the workplace. That's what the home is supposed to be, and that's what the woman is in charge of. Now, there's kind of two parts of this argument. The first is illustrated wonderfully by this political cartoon of the woman in a green dress. And if you look at it, what's happening is that her dress is too wide to fit into the voting booth. So the door is very narrow. She's got this very big sleeves. The hat is too big. The skirt is too large. How is she ever going to fit in? And what looks kind of silly and kind of funny right here actually has also some darker and deeper meanings. Women are too frivolous to vote. They're too concerned with fashion. Their mind is not made to handle politics. They can't even fit into the voting booth, let alone make the correct decision when they get in there. The notion behind this is that women are not logical. They are focused on the wrong kinds of things for politics. And that it's really just would be putting them into this contaminating and coarsening place, because women are supposed to be pure, and politics, if anyone knows, is not. And so you have to protect them, keep them out of there. But there's also a fear of what this would mean for families. So in this second political cartoon called Home, we see a man and his children bereft without the mother. You can see up in the corner a Votes for Women sign, and back sometime this evening, she's out working for suffrage. And once she gets the vote, what happens then? Because it's not just voting that comes with the 19th Amendment. Women could begin to serve in political office. They could also be serving on juries. And that opens up a whole new avenue of professions for women to be able to take part in. And they see this breakdown of the home. Now, of course, there are working class women who are already working at this time. But the fear here is what's going to happen to the middle class, to the mothers who are raising the next generation of politicians. And so we have here this real fear. Women don't have a place in politics. And that is one of the arguments you hear the most, both on a national level and the one that we think of immediately. And certainly it's an important argument to the anti-suffragists. But I would argue that it's not the most important when thinking of Alabama. the argument that's most important is race and states' rights. Now, these two are so interlinked in the anti-suffrage rhetoric that I can't talk about one without talking about the other. And so those two cartoons I just showed you for gender, those are national cartoons put in Puck magazine, distributed by the Massachusetts Anti-Suffrage Organization. These are two pieces in our collection here at the archives that were distributed in Montgomery, Alabama. So that's where they're printed, that's where they're distributed. So they're coming from this Women's Anti-Ratification League. And if you read through them, they are very telling on what the argument is. So this one here with the pictures of Mrs. Jerome Jeffrey, Frederick Douglass, and Annie Banks is a larger broadside that's called Political Expediency versus Your Immortal Soul. But here at the bottom describes a huge part of their argument. So it reads, will you force upon thousands of pleading, unprotected white women of the South, particularly the isolated farmers' wives, a return of the Reconstruction horrors, and call yourself a man? It goes on to say, think of the cruel injustices to the Negro race, of dragging him and his back into politics at the whim of a few outsiders. Your oath of office is your shield and buckler. And right here, remember this: to pass the Anthony Amendment is to bring into full force the 14th and 15th Amendments. So there's a lot to unpack there, but to start with, what are the 14th and 15th Amendments? Well, the 14th Amendment, they're both Reconstruction era amendments, and the 14th Amendment was adopted on July 9th, 1868, and it made all persons, regardless of race, who are born or naturalized in the United States, citizens of the United States. And that's important because it's focusing on the formerly enslaved people who previously were legally considered property and not full citizens. It's saying no. Now, in the eyes of the federal government, they are equal citizens under the law. So what does the 15th Amendment do? Ratified in 1870, it says that the right to vote will not be denied or abridged based on the account of race. So very similar, almost verbatim to the 19th Amendment, but focused on race. So that is giving, at the time, African American men the right to vote. So both men and women are seen as citizens, but just like there are only really mostly white male voters, now there are black male voters. And in Alabama, that meant from the 1870s until 1901, you have African American men voting and holding office in Alabama for the first time. But in 1901, everything changes. That is when the state constitution, the 1901 state constitution, is created, and provisions are put in that change the electorate. So things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, property requirements, and other discriminatory measures make most of Alabama's African American male and poor white male populations disenfranchised, or the right to vote is taken away from them. And so you have here this fear that by passing the 19th Amendment, that's going to disrupt what the 1901 Constitution did. I told you it's that second section, that Congress shall have power to pass whatever proper legislation it needs to enforce this law, which means the federal government will start getting involved in state voting requirements, investigating who gets to vote, and making sure that all women get to vote, and that the 15th Amendment, that you cannot make a discrimination based on race. So this means that you're looking at this chance of expanding the vote twofold to African American women and men. And we know that this is something that the Anti-Ratification League, beyond this, they wrote many other things about it. So on June 25th, 1919, the League wrote a letter to the Montgomery Advertiser, signed by Nina Pinckard and the rest of the executive committee. And it said, "We beg of you that you think long and clearly before voting for this amendment. It is the wolf gnawing at the vitals of both state and federal government. It is the seed from which may spring untold miseries in the future. The 15th Amendment is not dead. It only sleepeth. Why arouse it from its slumber?" Because by bringing the 15th Amendment to full force, like I said, you're going to have white women voting, you're going to have African American men voting, and you're going to have African American women voting. So that's the second piece of propaganda here is talking about the fears of Black women getting the vote. Now, most of it, if you read through, focuses on the fact that this was always the nefarious plot of the national suffrage group. This is what they were always planning. But here in the third paragraph, you can see really what they're focusing on here of why it would be bad. Why give them an opportunity by ratifying the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to create unrest and dissatisfaction? There was a fear, and you see this cropping up in other pieces of propaganda, of race war, that by opening up the vote to the African American population, there will become a political divide, a legal divide, and eventually will lead to a social racial war. Now, I would argue that in many ways, this is the more important argument that they're making. They're saying we can't have this federal amendment. It can be a state amendment. It could be something there because it could be controlled, but a federal amendment means inviting the federal government back into the state election process. And the bad part about that is that it would expand the vote to Alabama's African American population. And I don't just think that because I'm a historian, I think that because they actually told me that. So you have here in a later interview with Nina Pinckard, a quote about the purpose of the Anti-Ratification League. So it says, "While the Anti-Ratification League is opposed to the vote, its basic reasons for this sudden call to arms had in reality little to do with women's unfitness for the ballot. The mainspring of their action was not nominally the invasion of states' rights, but was in reality the race problem involved." And so they're creating all these different arguments and propaganda, open letters, posters, flyers, broadsides, so on and so forth, right? And they're very effective here in Alabama. So effective that the Alabama legislature chooses to reject the amendment on September 22nd, 1919. So it was a long process, many different votes, but that's the official date given for the rejection. And Alabama is the second state after Georgia to reject the amendment. So in some ways, that should be the end of the story, right? Nina Pinckard was successful here. Her league had formed. It achieved its objective. But Alabama wasn't enough for Nina Pinckard. She wanted a solid South. And so she took that local organization and turned it into the Southern Women's League for the rejection of the proposed Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And from now on, just for brevity's sake, I shall call it the Southern Rejection League. So she forms this and reforms it, and she wants to take this crusade across the South. And this is how she described it. "With the scalp of Alabama already to its credit, the League proposes to sweep the entire nation, North and South, and at the 11th hour, to wrest from the suffragists their hard-won triumph. So in late 1919, she takes her first trip around to Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Louisiana and Mississippi to help set up local organizations to help kind of talk about how you can get anti-ratification leagues really ready for this fight. And she has contacts all around the South, as far north as Maryland and as far west as Texas. She has these contacts sending her information back about what is happening in their legislatures. And one by one, they start to become successful. So this is what it looks like on the eve of her going to Tennessee. So all the gold are those who have ratified the amendment. There are 35. There are 8 who have outright rejected. Those are the red. You have a few who haven't voted yet. So in Vermont and Connecticut, the governors are refusing to call their legislatures. Florida and North Carolina, the anti-suffragists feel fairly confident that they will reject the amendment. But then you have Tennessee. And not only is it the next one to be going to vote, there is kind of a tenuous victory there. They're waiting to see what's going to happen. And so on July 18th, 1920, Nina Pinckard goes to Nashville for this final battle over the 19th Amendment. When she arrived, the Nashville banner was, talking about her great successes, how wonderful she was, her great executive abilities, and talked about all of her success across the South and the hope that she would be successful here in Nashville as well. She forms the headquarters at the Hermitage Hotel, and here she is in the center looking very intently at whatever document she's looking at. But she is really focusing in Nashville on taking all of these tactics she's had around and honing them in. She's writing open letters to legislators and other politicians. She writes an open letter to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She claims that Catt must not really know of the traditions of the South, because to support this amendment is to spit in the face of those traditions. She calls out the men of the legislature, saying, if you are true Southern men, you will reject this. But one of the centerpieces of her of her campaign was an exhibition. So this is the Anti-Ratification exhibition at the Hermitage Hotel. Inside, she boasted that she had proof that there were force bills, so bills that Congress had already drafted that would force states to comply with the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. She also had proof that they were all created by the same people with the same nefarious purpose of race war. She had photographs of Susan B. Anthony and her, quote, intimate friendships with Black women like Jerome Jeffrey and men like Frederick Douglass. It also had a copy of the Women's Bible, which was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and approved by Carrie Chapman Catt, that proved that they had a contempt for religion. Overall, this exhibit was meant to allow Tennessee legislators to walk through and leave with no guilt on rejecting the 19th Amendment. And so what happens on that fateful day? August 18th, 1920, as I said, there are 97 legislators coming in to vote, and the anti-suffragists feel relieved because they know that they have the votes. They have 2 votes in advantage, a 2-vote majority. But the last second, something changes. Banks Turner, who had really been an undecided vote but was being pressured to vote to reject, changed his mind and voted for ratification. But probably the most famous is Harry Burns, who had been a pledged anti-suffragist who wore the anti-suffrage red rose on the day of his vote, but at the very last second swapped and voted aye for ratification. So with that, we have 49 to 48 And then Seth Walker changes his vote, but he does it for more nefarious purposes. He does it because he wants to be on the winning side, because if you're on the winning side, you can call for a reconsideration vote. So now it's 50 to 47, and Seth Walker has 2 days to convince 2 more legislators to come to his side and stop this amendment in its tracks. He's unsuccessful, though, because people were pretty okay with the way they voted. So in a last-ditch effort, you'd have 31 Tennessee legislators who, in the middle of the night, leave Nashville and travel to Decatur, Alabama. And they come here because they're hoping to break a majority in the Tennessee legislature. And what that means is they'll give Seth Walker a few more days to get his votes, to bully some people into switching sides. Nina Pinckard left the day after. She stops in Decatur to greet them, calling them brave men in this crusade against the 19th Amendment. She invites them to come to Montgomery to spend time with her, have a party, because she knows they will be victorious. But they weren't. Because those men weren't there, they decided that there was no need for a reconsideration vote, since the majority of people who showed up were still for the amendment. So they passed it, sent it on to the governor. August 24th, he signs it. And August 26, 1920, the Secretary of State officially adopts it into the U.S. Constitution. And it was Tennessee that was that 36th and final state necessary. So what does Nina Pinckard do after that defeat? Well, she tries to get the Supreme Court to overturn it. She says Tennessee legislators were bribed. The vote was invalid. There was a reconsider vote that didn't get taken seriously. That there were other states that had ratifications that were questionable, that you can't let it go through. She tried everything to the point that the newspapers who had once lauded her now called her attempts pathetic. But she did say, if this responsibility is thrust upon women, she hopes that anti-suffragists will take up this obligation and do what they need to do, namely vote out every man who ratified the 19th Amendment. And so we don't know if she was one of those women who voted in 1920, one of the 300 Montgomery women who registered, but I was able to find her name as a later registered voter. And so we do know that before her life was done, she did vote in the United States. So what does she do for the rest of her life? Well, she writes some editorials, she's involved in more charities, and she lives a relatively good life until her death on January 4th, 1953. And coincidentally, it was 9 months later, on September 8th, 1953, that Alabama would finally ratify the 19th Amendment. So why do we care about Nina Pinckard? Well, she's a part of this story. She and the Anti-Ratification League explain how women's suffrage was such a controversial issue in Alabama. Also, their arguments, as well as the arguments that they shared with the suffragists over race, explain why 1920 cannot be the end of the story in Alabama. It would take another generation of women and men to fight for equality for all Alabamians. But Nina Pinckard is one of those people who can explain how political aspirations and political understandings can be so complex. She is someone who is fighting against women being involved in politics by being a woman involved in politics. But also her story is important for understanding how we as a state have always viewed these complicated issues. So I hope that you come to see justice, not favor, to learn a little bit more about the anti-suffrage movement, but also about the suffragists and about the women who are fighting for greater equality for all Alabamians. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much for telling us a little about Nina Pinckard and getting in the end there to this notion of complexity. That's really at the core of Alabama's suffrage story, isn't it? Is this notion of this complex dance and the other issues that play into it. I wanted you to go a little deeper and tell us about some of these other issues that Nina Pinckard involved herself in after the 19th Amendment until her death in 1953.
Definitely. So she was involved in like certain editorials and things like that about coming out, things like grammar, discussing what the new woman was. She was still involved with some women's issues. But one of the things she wrote the most about was actually cruelty to animals. She was very much against hunting, especially just hunting for sport. She was also against doing experiments on animals. And so she was a part of something called the Anti-Vivisectionist Society. And she was actually the leader of that. And she wrote many things about how we should, treat all creatures with respect, and how we should, especially with animals, should focus on protecting them as humans, as kind of a more, as she phrased it, as the smarter creatures on earth, to take care of all of life's, quote, dumb creatures.
And she was a bit of a grammarian too.
Yes,
and we've had fun talking about it. Tell us about some of her writings about grammar.
Well, so
proper punctuation.
She particularly with the Montgomery Advertiser, she wrote a couple of editorials about use of slang and also proper spelling, especially trying to encourage them to spell it the way that it's supposed to be in the United States and not English spelling. She was very upset about that, and would talk about using consistent spelling across time. So she wrote many letters to the editor about specifically the Montgomery Advertiser, which seemed to be her newspaper of choice. It was one she worked very closely with during the Antiratification campaign, but she also continued to write editorials for them throughout the rest of her life.
Tell me a little bit about Marie Owen after 1920. What do we know about Marie Owen as a registered voter?
Well, I believe she registered in 1920, and so that she was someone who, even before the 19th Amendment, she was fine with the idea of women's suffrage. And you'll see that with some of the Anti-Ratification League, is that they weren't opposed to women voting. It was that it was coming from a federal amendment. And so Marie Bankert Owen was a registered voter straight from the get-go in 1920, and continued to vote for the rest of her life.
So I want to pause here and invite any of our online viewers to post a question in the chat, and we will be able to get to that. But I want to ask you about the other side of the story, about some of the suffragists in the state. Were they talking about Nina Pinckard? Were they responding to her or some of the other members of the Women's Rejection League? What was that relationship like? Because I assume that some of them knew each other socially. They were many of them in the same social circles. So what was that like? Well,
I know that Bossy O'Brien Hunley was friends with a fair number of anti-suffragists. I don't know specifically with Nina Pinckard. And I think that she would sometimes find it slightly hypocritical that they were arguing against being involved in politics, but yet being so vocal themselves. I know she found some hypocrisy in the fact that then women were taking positions in government agencies after being so vocally against women's suffrage, and specifically the 19th Amendment. As far as the way Patty Ruffner Jacobs, who is a very kind of influential Birmingham suffragist who was both the president of the Alabama Association and later a member of the executive board for the National Suffrage Association, she spoke sometimes directly about them, but she spoke more generally. And one of my favorite things that she said is that, she hopes that one day the anti-suffragists will be commemorated just because they are the best antagonist to show what progress really is. And so there is some, I think, animosity between the sides and some kind of anger over the hypocrisy, but there's also, unfortunately, a lot of agreement over at least one of the arguments that they made. The argument of race is something that at least white suffragists in Alabama shared with anti-suffragists.
And that really goes back to the notion of complexity.
Yes.
The fact that there were so many of these issues that intersected for the 19th Amendment, but that otherwise they would have found themselves on similar sides. I want to shift gears here and get you to talk a little bit about one of your other projects that you've been involved with as we, as the country, have been marking the centennial of the 19th Amendment. I want you to tell us a little bit more about the National Votes for Women Trail and the sites in Alabama that are on that trail.
Definitely. So the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites partnered with William G. Pomeroy Foundation to create the National Votes for Women Trail. And what this trail is supposed to be is marking locations and sites of either events or homes of suffragists or kind of big moments in each state's suffrage history. And the certain qualifications, one thing, it had to be before 1920. So that was one of the big kind of qualifications. It had to be before ratification. And so we had to be creative with trying to look at different types of sites that are still standing, that are important to our suffrage story. And we were able to locate 6 sites, and say we because there was this larger committee of women, of fabulous women around the state who were doing research all around. And so we were able to locate sites in Huntsville, Decatur, Birmingham, Selma, Tuskegee, and Mobile. And all of these areas kind of tell a different part of the story. They talk about individual women. So you have in Mobile, Eugenie Marks, who was the president of the Mobile Equal Suffrage Association, and really important to educating that city about the issue. You have Adela Hunt Logan in Tuskegee, who was a Black woman who was a teacher at Tuskegee, who also helped expand the notion of suffrage that it should be for women of all races, and wrote at a national and local level about that issue. To organizations in Huntsville, where the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association met in 1914, and in Birmingham, kind of a fun one, it's going to be Rickwood Field, where they had a suffrage day. And we actually have 2 marker dedications that are coming up. So Huntsville and Decatur have already been unveiled and dedicated, but this Saturday, the marker at Rickwood Field in Birmingham is going to be unveiled and dedicated at 10 a.m. And then next Thursday, August 26th, the marker at Eugenie Marks's house in Mobile, which is on Government Street, is going to be unveiled and dedicated at 10:30 a.m. next Thursday. And so there's a lot of excitement kind of around that, and it's connecting Alabama to that larger movement.
And that's so important because as your presentation on Nina Pinckard shows, is that Alabama has a role to play in that broader suffrage story. Mm-hmm. I want to back up and ask you a question about the first time that the legislature voted on a suffrage amendment. This is something we'll talk about in the exhibit. You mentioned it briefly in your presentation. 1915, there's a state suffrage amendment that comes before the Alabama legislature. So if you could tell our viewers a little bit about that, but also tell us what was the motivation behind the anti-suffragists in that vote? Did it fall along those same lines as you laid out for 1919? Tell us a little about that.
So you have in January of 1915 a state suffrage amendment being proposed, and this is going to be an amendment to the state constitution that will allow for women to vote only in Alabama. It's only going to affect women in Alabama. And suffragists at first, they really focused on that here because they knew it was maybe more likely to happen. They knew that it was maybe going to be an easier route. And they also believed in the idea of states' rights as well, that it should happen at a state level, and only if that fails, go to a federal level. And so you kind of see this moment where it could happen. They thought they had the votes, and they're working all year to get it done, but then the very last second, they don't have a constitutional majority. So while technically more legislators voted for the amendment than opposed it, it wasn't a constitutional majority, so it did not get passed. And that happens in August of 1915. Now, what happened with anti-suffragists then is, like I said earlier, there wasn't really a formal anti-suffrage group, right? So that doesn't happen until 1916. But there was a lot of anti-suffrage sentiment, meaning a lot of politicians were anti-suffrage. There were women who were anti-suffrage. They just necessarily weren't an organized group. A lot of the thought process there, you have some legislators who are worried about the race issue. So State Representative Easterly writes that they'd be afraid as long as it specifically excludes African-American women, then he'd be okay with it. But if it doesn't, he worries of returning to a, quote, corrupt time. What he means is the Reconstruction era, where he believed that African-American voting was corrupting. And so you have state representatives, you have federal representatives, so J. Thomas Heflin, who is a congressman from Alabama, is adamantly opposed to women's suffrage. And they believe, again, the same general arguments. Women aren't prepared for politics. They don't really want it. It's just a few kind of crazy women who want it. You have people who are arguing that it's the race issue. The one thing they don't argue is the states' rights issue, because it's undeniable that this would be a state amendment. So that's the only thing you don't really see happening.
Thanks. Alex, I have one more question for you. You've been involved with the planning for Justice Not Favor since day one. You were in our very first planning meeting. This exhibit is just as much yours as anyone else's in this place. So I want to ask you to tell our viewers, what's your favorite piece that you're going to see on view in this exhibit, whether it's a textual piece, an artifact, a document, a photograph? What's something that you keep coming back to as really important to the suffrage story and that you want to tell people about to convince them to come see our exhibit? No pressure.
Oh. I will say, whether it's the most important, the one that I probably love the most is one that I actually just got to see. It's Bossy O'Brien's dress. And I do think it's important because Bossy O'Brien Hunley is a very important suffragist. She was a Birmingham suffragist who was unafraid. She was someone who debated congressmen without hesitation. She drove her car around Alabama when that wasn't something that a woman did. She spoke in front of men and women alike. And in many ways, she is someone who we can look up to as someone who was fighting for what she wanted and was unafraid to speak out. And this dress is just so intricate in detail, and she made it as a suffrage dress. It has the green and the purple and the gold of women's suffrage, and the detail in it is just astonishing to look at. And so I highly encourage people to come to see even just that alone. As far as documents, I couldn't tell you one document. I think that's the problem, is that I've spent too much time with all of them, that looking at them, I find myself just so entranced by everything. But one of the coolest documents is a ticket from Susan B. Anthony's talk in Decatur. So Susan B. Anthony, this famous national suffragist, made her way to Alabama, and she spoke in Decatur and Huntsville, and we have this ticket from that event, as well as a signed copy of her history of women's suffrage that she wrote to the woman who helped organize that talk. And so there's kind of that moment of chills where you realize how tied in Alabama was to that national story. So we have, this amazing suffragist who's so grounded here in Alabama, but also that we are tied to this larger story. And to me, both of those bring in how amazing Alabama's suffrage story is, and how kind of expansive it is.
Well, Alex, thank you for your presentation on Nina Pinckard today. Thank you for telling us about the National Votes for Women Trail. Thank you for queuing up interest in justice, not favor. We couldn't do it without you. So we thank you all for joining us today, and we will look forward to seeing you in our exhibit. We look forward to seeing you at our Food for Thought presentation on September 16th, and you can find more information about the archives, the exhibit, and our public programs on our website and on social media. Thanks, everybody.